broadband is off doing a kind of mini prom thing in his mate's back garden, so I've got to go and pick him up later on. So I'm on line.
On water. Okay.
Anyway, let us get rocking and rolling, and
Yep.
welcome all to another Scottish Data Science and Technology meetup. This time through the wonderful medium of virtual reality and digital and all that kind of good stuff. I've seen some familiar, friendly faces in the chat. Hello to you guys. Hello to everybody I don't know. It's great to see you all. It's great to see people tuning in from all over the world. This is something that we've ran in our Glasgow office now for a number of years, and obviously under current circumstances we've had to change it slightly, but the idea is always the same. We've got a cool speaker, we've got a cool audience, we're going to listen to a presentation, and we're going to ask some questions. So tonight, for obvious reasons, guys, what I'd ask you to do, if you do have a question while Nick's doing his presentation, stick your question into chat. The reason for me having a little bit of banter with you in chat was just to test the facility. Stick your questions into chat. If more than a few of you are asking the same question, I'll be happy to interrupt Nick and divert his flow. But if not, we've got all these great questions. Nick's going to be speaking for roughly 45 minutes to an hour. And when we get to the end of Nick's presentation, we'll go back into the chat and we'll cherry pick some of the questions out of that.
Rob, there's actually a Q&A box as well for questions. There's
Oh, I see it.
Yeah, so put
Sides.
the questions into the Q&A, could be good.
Okay, well that you've just befuddled me with technology there. So Q&A, stick your questions in there one way or another, Nick and I will get to them. Your beer should be in your fridge where you left it, and your crisps are in the cupboard. Help yourself to snacks and nibbles. Enough from me. I'm sorry, I should have introed myself. I'm Rob Huggins, Director of Client Services at MBN. Also on here we've got Michael Young. I'm going to leave Nick to do his own intro because he could do it better than I could. Time for me to shut up and time for the main man to take to the stage. Thank you very much, Mr. Nick Hall.
Hi, well, good evening, everybody. So up until about a few months ago, I led the Analytics, Data Science and Insights team for Barclays, the retail banks. That's a bit you will all be familiar with if you bank with us or if you've got a business that banks with us. And I guess what I want to share today was some thoughts and ideas that emerged from that experience. Prior to Barclays, I spent a short amount of time in the beer industry, and prior to that, I spent about 16 years in consulting. So where I was sort of building analytics and helping build analytics teams for clients, mainly in financial services. So that's the kind of the experience that has caused me to reflect on some of this, and these meetups are a great way of sharing some of these ideas. And obviously, if they're in person, we could have done a lot of chit chat across the room. We can't do that, but I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts and input on what I've got to say. Anyway, but without further ado, let's sort of jump into talk a little bit about my team and some observations that we made as a team over the last 5 or 6 years about the analytics work we were doing. But I'm going to start by taking you back, as the title implies, to 1848. So we're going to go back to 1848, and as you can see, kind of selfie technology had a long way to go in those days. But these two rather alarming people were firsts of their time. This is the first person to discover gold in the Californian Gold Rush, and the first person to become a Californian Gold Rush millionaire, but for very different reasons. So the first guy is called James Marshall, and James was famous for January 24th, 1848. He discovered gold whilst he was building a mill, a place called Sutter's Mill. He worked for a guy called John Sutter, and they were building this mill. And as part of the excavation, he came across gold. Very exciting. And he is the person who's credited with sort of first identifying that California contained gold fields and to a certain extent started the whole thing. Now, sadly, he made no money. Not only did he make no money, but the mill that he and John Sutter were building soon got abandoned because, of course, all the people who were being carpenters and helping them build this thing all zipped off to go and do some prospecting and see if they could find gold of their own. So he lost his workforce. The mill fell into disrepute. Fell into disuse, and he went bankrupt. So a sad story, sad end. Happier story for Samuel Brannan on the right there. He was a journalist, a businessman, a settler in the area, and a bit before Marshall discovered gold, he had opened up a store nearby, a place called Sutter's Fort. The only store between San Francisco and the gold fields. So you can see where this story is going. He really capitalized on that. He bought up all the picks, shovels, pans. For example, he bought pans at 20 cents and sold them at $15 each. So the guy made a fortune because of all the settlers that came into the area. And he even, and this just shows you how kind of full value chain this guy was, he even bought up the local paper. And if you go to Wikipedia, there's a story that he was kind of publicizing, selling papers by walking down San Francisco High Street saying, gold, gold, they found gold. Obviously talking up the benefits of people rushing to the area and buying all his goods. He became the first millionaire. There were other millionaires, people who made money through the gold, but he's credited to being the first person to kind of make his million out of the gold rush. And those two stories kind of illustrate what has become a bit of a business metaphor that many people know about, and I'm sure you've all heard, which is, but Mark Twain was credited with this sort of originally packaging it up into the right metaphor. During the gold rush, it's a great time to be in the pick and shovel business, or indeed the railroad business, or the real estate business, or the jeans business, or even the onions business, apparently, since somebody made a lot of money out of selling onions to the settlers, or of course, the bucket business. So why do I talk about that metaphor? Well, I don't think it's comes as any surprise, or I don't think it requires, it's very controversial to say we're in our gold rush now. The data revolution, people talk about it as being the new oil. You could think about it as the new gold rush, but there's certainly a lot of money being thrown around in the system. Even to say, even with some of obviously the shocks that happened to the economy, total market cap of the kind of FANG stocks are well over $4 trillion. Even the Chinese BAT stocks over $1 trillion, even after a couple of $100 billion coronavirus sell-off. So still incredible amounts of shareholder value locked up in these data-driven companies. And the total value of the US unicorns, so these are privately held companies worth over $1 billion. There are about 170 of them in the US, valued at over 0.6 trillion last year. And even the venture capitalists are still pouring money into this space. 65 billion last year of deal value, and even in the opening to 2020, which obviously not a great year for the economy for obvious reasons, but inward tech investment to the UK was about 5.3 billion into this sector. And last year, and actually, well, to date, the last 12 months to date, the UK itself has produced 6 unicorns and 66 potential unicorns. So one's just bubbling under $1 billion of value. So there definitely is, the gold rush is on. So who's going to make the money? Is it going to be the people digging for gold and the people, all the people selling the buckets? If you actually look at the big players, it's interesting. I think they're kind of doing a bit of both. If I'm Facebook, I'm selling ad space in your newsfeed, and that's how I'm using data to make my money. But I'm also selling services on the outside, like providing platforms for businesses, white labeling the like button. Amazon, very obvious full platform provider. They're both making money from mining gold, mining their own data. But they've also got a pretty substantial, fast-growing business helping other people do the same, be it leasing space on AWS cloud or whatever it might be. Apple the same. Netflix was the only one when and this was kind of loosely put together a couple of nights back. So I'm sure somebody can give me a refined version of this. Netflix was the one where it wasn't clear whether there was a sort of golden bucket strategy going on there. Netflix clearly making a lot of gold by taking their data and using that to, for example, commission content based on the aggregated preference data of its users. Not sure whether they're doing B2B services, but interesting, there are a bunch of players out there like Wowzer and Vodlix and Movie who are offering to help you set up your Netflix equivalent. So a classic I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to dig for gold, but I am going to help you go and do some mining. And then Google very much using data for huge commercial advantage itself, but also selling a lot of services that help people like us in our data analytics teams sell kind of drive value out of our data as well. So that's so much for the platforms businesses. What's happening on kind of in the world where I'm assuming we're in, and I'm kind of assuming I'm talking to, and this may or may not be true, but I'm talking to an audience of people who, like me, were doing analytics for their businesses. In other words, you're probably providing models, data, insights for in order to kind of enhance the commercial value of your own business, or enhance the impact if you're working in a kind of public policy type environment. So what's the situation like for us? Well, certainly there are a bunch of people who are making lots of money selling us picks and shovels, I think. There are a lot of people out there making very good business, providing capabilities and tools and data that will allow us to kind of do our jobs better. But if you've read the same kind of articles as me, you'll know there's lots of doom and gloom. And actually, we had a talk from Harvinder Atwal last week in a sort of similar kind of format to this, and the guy from moneysupermarket.com, and he was quoting some of these headlines. It's quite a fun game. If you go on and Google failure of data analytics or failure of big data, you can literally just start accumulating the headlines. It's kind of what I did to produce this list of kind of where the narrative is, you know what, there's lots of interesting stuff out there, but not many people are landing stuff, scaling stuff, actually making things have commercial impact. The last three I love. Gartner 2015, 60% of big data projects will fail over the next 2 years. 2 years later, they say, actually, we went back and looked and it was 85% of them failed over that time frame. And now they're saying 80% of analytics initiatives will not deliver any outcomes through 2022. So there's a narrative out there that says, you know what, there's lots of people doing clever things with data, but we're not actually making commercial impact out of it. And this kind of worries me as a professional in this space. It worries me and frustrates me, and I don't know whether you've seen similar pictures to the one on the left, but I also see a lot of these shiny buckets, as I like to call them, with big data, where we see some interesting, cool imagery. But you ask yourself, where is the value? What is that cool big data imagery showing me? Sometimes you can be kind of disappointed in the answer. And I contrast that with the very simple sketch on the right. And this is back in our gold rush times. This is 1854 now, just a few years after gold was discovered in California. This is a map of Soho, and London was going through another pandemic at its time, one of slightly smaller scale, but perhaps slightly worse in terms of outcomes. So it was the cholera epidemic. And this really simple chart was produced by a guy called John Snow, not that one, but the doctor. And the prevailing hypothesis at the time was cholera was being carried by the miasma, the bad air. It was people breathing in the bad air and catching the cholera, and it was being transported from infected places through the air. Snow didn't believe this. He thought his hypothesis was it was the water, and it turned out he was correct. And in order to kind of convince people and take action, which is kind of the theme of this talk, to convince people to take action, he plotted this very simple picture. The red blobs are sadly deaths, and the little blue things, if you can see them, are actually water pumps in the area. And he did this just to demonstrate really simply, really graphically, that, you know what, the deaths are related to this particular pump in the middle of the picture. And he got the council to disable the pump and stop it serving water, so people went elsewhere, and he saved a lot of lives. So I sort of deliberately draw the contrast between what's cool and very pretty, maybe more art than insight, and one of the things we have to do is produce things that maybe aren't quite as so cool, but are definitely insightful and impactful like this. And why should you care? Well, I'll leave you with this. This is our final kind of gold rush picture, but this is a picture of the fate that awaits us all if we don't add enough value to through our analytics efforts. This is a picture. The blue that's sort of overlapping the buildings here is reclaimed land where they grew the San Francisco footprint out into the bay. Because there was so much need for more space, and the town slowly grew. And I don't know whether you can see, but there are kind of little brown lozenges under that blue, which are the sites of defunct ships where people brought their ships and they left them because they then went to open mines and then either made a fortune, lost a fortune. And so there are all these shipwrecks lying underneath the floor of the San Francisco town, ships left by people abandoned during the gold rush. So we don't want to become landfill, I guess, is the final message. So let's talk a bit about the point of the analogy, and hopefully it's a blindingly obvious one, but therefore perhaps more powerful for that effect because of that, is in the gold rush you can make money by actually doing the mining or by selling buckets to people who want to do the mining. The problem is if everyone is selling buckets and there's no mining going on, then the whole system doesn't work. So somebody's got to be striking gold. If you're a big player, you can probably do both. But I'm assuming those of us who are in the analytics provision business actually should be mining for gold. And so one of the thoughts of this talk is be sure you are actually mining for gold and not accidentally selling buckets. How can you spot whether you're doing that, and what can you do about it? So let's kind of shift gears and talk a bit about the team. So this is my team, or some of them anyway. I'm going to talk a bit about what we were as the kind of team that it was, because this stuff is so contextual. So you will have your own setup, you'll be organized in your own way, your own companies. You might be a consultant doing this for many clients who will all have their own kind of organizational model. So let me tell you a little bit about how we were organized, and then you can kind of interpolate or extrapolate the lessons from this to fit your own situation. We were a sort of centralized cross-discipline analytics team, and by cross-discipline I mean we were a mix of people who did analytics, some hardcore data scientists, some people who were kind of more at the data engineering end. We had insights professionals. We had about 140 people altogether. We didn't have a mandatory role. So this is banking, financial services, classic user of analytics. There were a set of the usual analytics teams in the bank. There was a risk analytics team. There was a fraud analytics team. But we were the only central analytics team for general business performance, business insight. And we didn't have a mandatory role. And what I mean by that is nobody needed to come and ask us for stuff. So that was both a strength and a weakness. Obviously, the weakness was if we kind of sat back and did nothing, then eventually we would all be out of jobs. But the strength was it kind of allowed us to a little bit of leeway to think about what our role should be, and as I'll talk about later, be a bit more proactive. So in a sense, that was a very good thing. We were pretty much the main analytics team, although there were a great number of periphery teams doing other things for kind of specialist applications. We were free at the point of use. We could do a whole talk, and in fact we might want to pose doing a talk on if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think that's a really interesting topic in its own right. But rightly or wrongly, we didn't charge for our services. There was not even a shadow charge really for our service. As you'll see later, we made one up because we actually thought it was quite helpful to have that. But at the time, anybody could come in and commission a project and get it off us. We also, interestingly enough, developed over the 6 years or so I was with the team an external revenue earning remit. So we actually built an external consulting unit. So we were kind of doing analytics for clients using our transactional data, which again is an interesting story in its own right. But it meant we were thinking about this concept of how valuable is the insight that we're providing. So we kind of oriented ourselves as an internal consulting function, and we kind of integrated analytics, insights, and data science. So that was our setup. Now, when we first got together, I think we would say the value impact was mixed. Now, that's not to say the quality was poor. The quality was of the work was really good. We had a good reputation across the business. But the recommendations we made weren't always necessarily actioned. There was a lot of repeated work. So classic, if you looked at some of the projects that have been going on for some time, you could see that we were kind of sizing an opportunity, and then 3 months later we might be resizing, and then 3 months later you get a request, oh, the data's a bit out of date, can you kind of resize it? And there was no actual action being taken. So it was kind of good business to a certain, in the sense of we were busy, but not good business in the sense of it being impactful. There were situations where we'd make what we call false consensus. So you go and present the final outcome of the project, you present the final work, you get agreement around the table. Yes, great, we're going to go forward and either adopt the recommendation or implement the model, deploy the model, whatever it might be. And then later that would get unpicked, and you'd find, the consensus you reached in the meeting didn't actually carry through to action. And then we might make decisions, and then we might de-risk those in the final implementation to the point where they were a lot less impactful than the kind of original recommendation we made. So there was a problem. The cartoon is tongue-in-cheek. My team won't thank me for sharing that. In fact, I think one of them found it. It tickled me. The work was not bad. It was not dumb. It was good work, but it wasn't always used, wasn't always actioned. To give a couple of examples, so actually, and this is the yin and the this is a good and bad, right? So the first one did some really interesting customer portfolio modeling. So this was taking our customer base, figuring out the kind of the economics of each customer. We applied a pretty interesting segmentation that had some really good insight around what was going on with those customers and their relative economics, and did a whole bunch of profiles around creating insight about what you might want to do with those customers. Lot of attention and much poured over, but not applied. So kind of limited tangible impact. Compare that with the right-hand side, which is a forecast model we built. Absolutely fabulous impact. And there we were building, and this is part of the secret, we were working within the team that was essentially running the pricing for our mortgage book. Built this forecasting model directly with that team. Allowed us to kind of forecast using elasticity modeling where the applications were going to go, and that had significant PBT impact and was kind of used. So in both cases, if you like, it was a bucket, because in both cases we were providing a data or an asset that the business then had to go and use and apply, but in one case it didn't get work, and in the other case it did. And just giving another example, we came up with some really high potential income opportunities that weren't converted. So we were, so for in our loans business, for example, we were losing to some low cost loan providers. I can't possibly tell you who those were, but we were essentially looking for how can we win against what was essentially a set of a bit of lending that was very much lower in price than we could match. But the team did some really sophisticated behavioral modeling to find some pockets of the portfolio where we think we actually had a really good product to offer those customers. And we proved great proof of concept, but there was low and slow scale up of that due to a lack of marketing and campaign management bandwidth. So again, great idea, well executed analytically, but didn't come up with, didn't actually make enough impact on the bottom line of the business. So we're analysts, right? So what do? We started applying a bit of analysis and a bit of data to our own business, starting with a fairly obvious step, which is let's just look at the book of business and start segmenting it a bit and seeing what's working, what's not. And we started to talk about kind of direct impact and indirect impact. But to use the analogy we're playing with here, the indirect stuff was the making better shovels. So there was a whole set of work we were doing where obvious one, MI and dashboards. Okay, there's no immediate impact of that. You're providing data, and the hope is somebody's going to take that data, figure out something that it means, and then go and take an action. Segmentation, again, a fabulously insightful process you can go through, hugely valuable from a strategy perspective. But in a sense, you are creating a better shovel, a better bucket. Somebody else has to go and do something with it. Similar customer profiling. Similarly with scenario modeling, did a lot of scenario modeling, built some quite complex scenario models. But again, those were things where we expected somebody else to take an action. Predictive model, did a lot of work around journeys, customer journeys. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. And looking at journey leakage. But again, you were providing data and insight to somebody who had to go and use it. On the flip side, we were finding some gold. So there was a lot of work doing price setting and price implementation, and that was kind of immediate bottom line impact, very measurable, very visible. Really kind of grew our value opportunity. There were teams doing customer contact campaigns, again, very measurable in terms of getting messaging or alerts or service messages out to customers. There were projects where we were intervening with colleagues, i.e. intervening with people on the front line to either help them with data, help them with training, and those had really good impact. Any kind of intervention with the customer, any kind of control improvement, and anywhere we were doing decision optimization. So there were a set of projects where we definitely said, great, these are kind of gold extraction projects, and they were good. I guess the insight we came up with was not to say you can't do the stuff on the left, because that was a really important portion of the work. But the insight, if I can call it that, was simply we should really only be doing stuff on the left if it is linked to the follow-up activity on the right. So blindingly obvious to say, but not always easy to do. And of course, sometimes the activity on the left, which actually implements your model, isn't within your remit. It's not an analytic job. But I think that's where you have to start thinking about scoping the project a little bit differently, and that's kind of what led us on to doing some of the things we did. So let me talk a bit about some of the shifts we made. So as I said, we kind of looked at some of these projects, and then we didn't throw stuff out, but we said, can we change it? Can we extend it? So I talked about dashboards. Dashboards is an interesting topic in its own right. We could do a whole meeting on dashboards. We'd probably need a lot of beer though. We had Barclays has over 200 customer journeys. So these are packages of activity where a customer is trying to attempt something with the bank that's useful to them. So take out some money, pay in a check, pay in some money, open an account, whatever it might be. And obviously they're doing that, like most of the banks in the UK, they're doing that across a multi-channel network. So they could be doing that through the branch, through some kind of text message, through an ATM, through mobile, and more often than not, they're doing it through a bit of both, right? They're actually, the whole journey takes place across these channels. So how do you keep track of that? So the bank has a pretty rich set of MI about all of that stuff. Actually, not produced by my team. There was a tech team that produced MI, and we had some really good dashboards around journey analytics that said how were those journeys performing against their KPIs by journey, by channel. So this is great stuff, right? This is the kind of thing that I think if you had to build this from scratch, you'd feel pretty chuffed about it by the time you'd finished. And indeed, the tech guys who produced this, I think, were pretty pleased with what they'd created. A lot of value being added, right? But not if it's not being used. So one thing we did with this was not only did we have this data, which is the kind of behavioral transactional data, we also had the NPS data. So for each of those journeys, we had some insight into what was the customer thinking about the quality of that journey. And by putting those two things together, we created again, still a dashboard, one might argue, but it was a slightly more helpful interpretation of that data. And we created two synthetic scores. One was around the experience, so good, bad, indifferent. How did you feel doing that? And then the other one by measuring kind of the time it took and the dropouts, or if they occurred, or whatever it might be. gave a sense of the effort. And you could then put all those 200 journeys on this picture, and you got to create something that was a lot more driving at here's an action. So I've got journeys that are in the upper left, terrible experience, but what the hell? It didn't take me too much time, so I'm not that bothered as a customer. Or down the bottom right, actually, that was a really good experience, but boy, it took me a long time. And then the red flags were things that were both awful for the customer and hard for them to do. So suddenly this gave us something where you could pick out the outliers on this, or even the sort of efficient horizon, if you like, and go after, out of those 200 journeys, really pin down where you were going to put the effort. So this wasn't the action, this wasn't yet gold, but it was getting closer to action. Another example was we were doing some work where, again, how many times, and again, this would be great if we were here live, I could get show of hands. But how many times have you done a project where you've come up with for your business, wow, there's a £40 million opportunity here, £30 million opportunity. If only we could tackle this end of the model spectrum and fix their problem. We had a load of those, but that is not the same. Finding that 40 million opportunity is not the same as 40 million pounds appearing on the P&L. So the left-hand side was something where we had modeled the effort it was taking for individual employees, colleagues, to process cases. This happened to be in our mortgage business. And for mortgages, the kind of operational complexity, the speed with which you can do operations, has a huge lever on how much business you can do. So if that's where your constraint is, by leaving that up, then you can do a lot more mortgage business. We had found areas where tasks were being processed inefficiently, and this was not kind of getting at the individual. Just to be clear, when we say task processed inefficiently, this was very rarely a performance or a skills issue of the individual. It was much more a, what are the tools they've got, what's the data they've got, what's the process they're trying to do, and we could find pockets of where that was harder than it should be. So we identified a bunch of things where we thought you could fix that productivity, which would open up capacity, which was worth a lot of money. And in this case, we were kind of getting into the flow of let's extend projects. We went straight in, rather than stopping there and just letting that model be poured over for the next 3 months and everybody to admire it and step back and admire the problem from a different angle. We actually went straight into, okay, here are the 8 initiatives you need to do to go and capture that money. So we deliberately constructed a kind of phase 2, if you like, without kind of waiting to be asked or for that to be part of the remit. We said we actually created the project definitions that said, here's the 8 projects that we can do off the back of this insight that kind of gets you to money. Now, often it was nothing more than tracking the implementation, but the point was we kind of earned the right to define the project, we earned the right to look on the project, and therefore we earned the right to work on the implementation and help push it to action and to finally getting money. Oop, wrong way. And that kind of measurement, you could take kind of the next level. So this is a third sort of big shift that I think was important for us, which was from straight recommendations to testing different recommendations to find which was the one that worked the best. So in many cases, I'm sure in common with all of the other big banks, one of our big shifts is how can we get more people, more customers using things digitally where it's more convenient for them. And one of the best ways of doing that is to use that human contact you've got. So we've got great frontline colleagues who are on the phones or in the branches who can help move a customer to using their banking digitally. And then the question is, how do you do that in a way, that takes skills, it takes knowledge. And so there was a whole set of programs around upskilling people into how to do that. How effective is that? Does that work? Rather than relying on people's intuition, or rather than having some senior guy go into a branch and kind of observe, oh, it looks a bit better than it was the other day, so I think it's working. We kind of measured this very rigorously, had a bunch of control branches, measured them against a bunch of test branches, and demonstrated that the training was indeed effective. And not only that, because you can say not only it works, but you can see the degree to which it works, so that allows you to value it, so that allows you to put more confidence behind the rollout process, the implementation process. So that shift from not just recommending we should kind of do this intervention, but then saying, and here's how we can test it and drive the rollout was a powerful change. And the last one was another testing example. Again, here we were looking at customers were going through a journey. A few of them were having a pretty tough time, and we were getting poor sentiment scores. So could we predict that sentiment? So the first thing was predicting sentiment, which again, a classic modeling job. I'm sure many of you guys have done that. But then we came to test the intervention and look at for certain customers how effective was the intervention. And that allowed you to say, okay, this intervention, not only does it work and it's worth doing, but it really works on these kind of customers. And if it's the kind of intervention that you can target individually, and a lot are, certainly in the banking space, you can then do something like this, which is kind of score the whole base, and you can say, for these 20%, it was a classic Pareto rule, for these 20%, I can get 80% of the benefit, a huge shift in behavior if I do this intervention, send this text, send this SMS, whatever it might be, whatever the help was. For these customers, because they're the sort of people who are in the right situation to receive this text and are kind of open to it and have the wherewithal to change their behavior, I'll send it to these guys. I've got another 80% which I can't influence. So it does two things. One, focuses you on rolling out and implementing immediately the thing that works for the right customers, and then turns your attention to, okay, I've got to do something else, not this, for these remaining customers. So it kind of helps drive the decision-making process and gives people confidence that they can then take action. And so part of this thesis, part of the thought is that I think is part of our job as analytics professionals, is to drive that kind of confidence into the decision-making process. Yep. So pause for breath. So that was kind of our story. A couple of reflections, and these are kind of in my old strategy consulting days, we used to call ideas strong ideas loosely held, by what I mean they're well thought through and there's lots of backup, but really willing to hear challenges to them. So people out there may have a very different view. First of all, why is it easy to get drawn into the bucket business? I think there is a false illusion that we might have of adding value, because when you produce something that is insightful, even if you've got insight in it, whether it's really interesting profiling you've done, or a product model that you've created, or a scenario that you've kind of worked through, chances are your client, your stakeholder, your sponsor will be delighted by what you've created, because it's going to give them insight and it's furthering their thinking. I've got to stop there, because that's all you really want to delight your client. But you soon learn that actually that's not enough. And even in the consulting business, the consultants that win are the ones that can genuinely show they've added value to their clients. And I think for internal data and analytics teams, really being able to show and measure and point out the value you've added at the end of the year, when we all look at the P&L and everybody celebrates or commiserates, it's really important to be able to point at the value that's been added, and that only happens when the stuff's been implemented. The other kind of subtle thing, as I say, this is now why are you sometimes drawn to it? Why is it easy to do? It can be quite a lower risk way of doing it, of doing things. It's very low risk to create a propensity model or create a predictive bit of code that says these are the customers that that I think we should intervene because they're, for example, financially vulnerable. When you actually go out and do it, and you've actually got to contact those customers, you get into all the messiness of how do I deal properly with a human being? Did that effect? Did that action have unintended consequences? Was it good for the bank, bad for the bank? And if it was bad for the bank, it might have lost us money. If it's good for the bank, it might have made us money. It's higher return, but it's higher risk. So one of the things I think you've got to really guard against is, do I only want to kind of take the project this far because it's kind of sticking your head above the parapet to go further? And the third reason is the more complex one, and this is well worth a debate if we were going to stick around and have beers after this session. It can be a very legitimate reason. I think there are very legitimate reasons why teams should be in the bucket business, and that's if it's a fast route to scaling your impact. So if I can build one tool and put it in the hands of 200 people, that's a great way of scaling impact. I guess my point is, and the thing to be really aware of is, one, is that what you're doing? Is the thing you're creating about to go into a big population? Does that population exist out in the business and they're going to use what you've created? And then secondly, do you have any control over how well that happens? And if you don't have any control, should you? My answer to that is yes, you probably should. And it's superficially easy to get drawn into it. Why is it a bad thing? Hopefully these are relatively obvious, but just to skip through them quickly, I think there's a huge risk of you becoming a substitute for action. So it's really easy if I can't progress the project because I've got no investment funds, nothing's going to happen this year, but hell, I can get the analytics team to do me a couple of months of analysis, and I can sort of think a bit more deeply about the problem. That's work you might get asked to do, but I would argue it's work you want to strip out of your portfolio because at the end of the year, it won't actually have contributed much to the business. There's another more subtle point, and I think this I would really urge anybody who thinks it's fine. We're an MI group, so we only have to produce MI, or we only build models, and there's another team in the other part of the business that implements them, so we're okay. I think there's a real danger that you can lose sight of the commercial relevance of the work we do, and I think the most important reason to make sure that the team you're in, or the business you're in, or the consulting firm you're in, is kind of close to the value creation, is because it makes you think more differently about how you do the work. So you can become more pragmatic. Classically, the Pareto rule: if I'm going to make a decision, I may only need 20% of the work gets me 80% of the certainty behind the decision, so I don't need to do 100% of the work. I think a lot of MI and dashboard creation would be hugely improved if the starting point, if a lot more thought was put into what are the decisions that are going to get taken off the back of this, and therefore how does the data need to be structured and presented, as opposed to let's put some data together and present it to the business. And then the third one is a bit political, I'll admit, but realistically, unless you're actually the CEO of the business, and probably even then, the reason you need to have this stuff demonstrate its worth is because otherwise you'll lose the investment fight. And that's not just the investment fight for actual funding, but it could be something as subtle as the investment fight for attention. So are you listened to? Do you get priority when your stuff has to be implemented? Do the people in the organization want to come and work in the analytics team or work for you? All of those things I think get enhanced if you can make sure that the outcome of your work is more mining gold than selling buckets. So so that's kind of a what and a why, if you like. Let's quickly say what are 2 or 3 things we did to get better at mining. And obviously, if I was pitching software, this is the point at which I'd say, if you install our software, it'll all work. Surprise, surprise, I'm not going to say that. I think the following things are really, really important. They may not be, I think they're really necessary, they may not be sufficient. I think they were pretty much sufficient for us, but these are some of the things that we went and did as a consequence of those observations. So the first thing, and I really believe strongly in this one, is start by managing the work for value. And by that I mean, so by the way, so on the page on the left, the picture on the left is highly stylized, so it doesn't give anything away. But actually, it kind of reveals the sort of dynamic we saw. we had different teams facing off against different parts of the business. So you've got 11 different parts of the business shown here. So think of one of these as might be the lending business or the mortgages business or the current accounts business. And the teams varied in size, and they had and they had their own project portfolios. And so we started valuing the impact of the projects in year. And we actually also, if you like, figured out our charge out rate. Now that was not really our costs, because we weren't going to use salary costs, and anyway, our salaries don't necessarily relate to necessarily just to our cost base. But if you remember, I said at the beginning of this that one of the things we did was we actually were selling our time on the outside. So we had an external consulting business. So obviously we had a rate card for that. So we took that rate card and we essentially applied it to the time that we spent internally into the business. So if you like, month on month, we had we essentially had a bill that we could have sent. We didn't. We could have sent to the business that said, you spent 1.2 million with the data analytics team this month, and here's what we returned for you. And the red line is kind of is pretty arbitrary, but the red dotted line is, let's assume, good rule of thumb, in the professional services business, you ought to be returning a little bit. You ought to be returning in excess of 10 times your professional fees. So that's the line of 10 times value. So you can see we had teams that were well above that. I won't say who is who, but you can bet the consumer lending team was above that line. And then there were teams that were either for good reasons or maybe for reasons that needed attention, we're not earning the returns they should be, or driving the value they should be. And of course, in some cases, we were doing strategic projects that were hard to value, projects that were about mitigating risk or implementing controls, which actually had huge value to the business, but didn't have a PBT value. And so those things went into the big. So this was not necessarily if you were in team 8, you weren't kind of out of a job. But if you were in team 8, we might be saying, is there anything we can do? Are there different projects we could do? Could we change the nature of some of those projects? So what we were doing with this was we would target the teams with value-based targets and get a bit of accountability to give the team a sense of, here's what we're going to try and do this year. We would have forums to manage that, kind of shadow impact. And we'd actually have stakeholders within our part of the business that said, where we would say, we think we've added X to your business, would you agree? It was free money for them, so it didn't cause a huge amount of controversy, but it was good to have the debate. We then tracked that process, and the tracking was the most important. So it gave us a data flow that meant that we could then refine and optimize what we were doing. And the optimizations were pretty obvious, which is shrink the low end, so work with stakeholders and remove some of those low value adding requests, and or substitute with self-service. So that's obviously a big part of what people should be doing in analytics teams, is creating more self-service for the business. So there might be opportunities, uncovered opportunities to do that. And then the last one is perhaps the most interesting, and I think that one of the most important, which is kind of growing that top end. So proactively either scaling up things that work at a small scale, rolling out things that have worked, or maybe redefining projects so that you are growing your influence into the implementation area. But some three classic ones where we did was general optimization, specifically pricing and optimization of pricing, and improvements to journeys. So that managing for value was, I think, a really important first step. Second thing, Harvinder last week gave a great talk on agile data ops, and he's written a book on this. So look up practical data ops. I'm on a commission, so where he talked a lot about agile, and it made a huge amount of sense. Some of the things he was saying about what he was doing with his team in the agile area. I would say I don't think we were doing deep agile and thinking at the depth that he was talking about. I would say we were really just, one of the things we're focusing on is kind of illustrated by the left-hand picture. Anybody in the telecoms industry knows they talk a lot about the last mile to the customer, and that's really important, particularly as we've ramped up data usage over the last 2 to 3 decades. The last mile to most customers used to be twisted copper pair. So it was a huge bottleneck to for the telecoms networks. And so these guys, the I think often called the holes and poles guys, were the heroes of the hour, because they were both either fixing or upgrading that last mile of cable into the customers' homes. And the telecoms guys recognized that the last mile of the customer was essential for them to be able to add value and to deliver value. And it's a bit more abstract, but there's a kind of a last mile for certainly us in banking, which is how you're actually going to touch the customer. What are you going to do that gets the model you've created to touch the customer? So creating agile cross-functional teams was really important. But for that reason, I would say, as opposed to agile is good because everybody's doing it, and cross-functional is good because everybody talks about doing cross-functional. For us, what cross-functional meant was the last mile was represented in the room. In other words, if I needed to get copy out, if I needed to send an email and I needed to get copy, then I needed to get that approved by somebody from legal. There better be somebody from legal in the room. So because you don't want that to then kind of disappear into some different decision-making process. So we certainly didn't crack this completely by the time I'd left, but it was, I think, when we talked about agile cross-functional, this is what we meant. Get mixed disciplines, a common problem domain, so different functions represented, all after the same problem, which might be, let's get more customers to use things more digitally, and everything you needed to action, the insight and touch the customer and business. And you can do this large scale for big change projects, and many businesses do. But you can think about it quite small scale as well. Even doing, I'm about to build a segmentation. If the business is going to use that segmentation, what are they going to do with it? Okay, do we have all of those disciplines represented in the room? So it's a good, we didn't always get it right, but it was a good discipline to have. Third thing, skills. It was funny, I say last week I was on one of these sessions that Michael and Robin had organized, and we had a huge debate about skills. I think it's a fascinating topic in its own right. We talked a bit about hard skills and soft skills there. I'd have a slightly different play on it, which is sort of this diagram attempts to get at, which is what's really important in our analytics teams is obviously the technical skills. That's kind of what people expect us to bring. So do you know your stats? If you're doing sophisticated stuff, do you know your machine learning? Can you build models? Can you think about computational science issues so you know basics of how to create performant code or performant models? Do you have access, or do you have people who can do data engineering and the DevOps type thinking in your team? Those technical skills are really important. And if you're building people's careers in teams like this, then there needs to be a program of development of those technical skills. But if you're going to be effective, I also think you need to think about the right-hand side. And the right-hand side, I say, it's not necessarily soft skills, because there's some hard skills in there, like microeconomics, management accounting. Can you read a P&L? Those are pretty technical skills in their own right. But they're all to do with that right-hand flow, which is you want to be able to frame the decision. What's the decision we're making? You want to be able to define it well, figure out in the business who's going to make that decision and what the rules are. You need to take the action, define what the action is, and then you need to measure the outcome. And so there are a whole bunch of things that you need to be good at to be able to do that flow of work. Stakeholder management, you've got to understand the microeconomics of a business. You've got to be able to structure a problem, pyramid principle, that good stuff. You've got to understand basic accounting, both from a management perspective and to read a P&L from a financial perspective. And at the end, if you're going to get people to make a decision, often you're going to be on your feet, telling the story of your results and persuading them to take action. So that's a whole kit bag of skills that I think we kind of loosely taught people at first. And I think we got much more zeroed in on that we need a program that really makes sure that there's both a foundational level of these skills in the team across everybody. And then you can even say there are people in the team who specialize in doing really good storytelling, and they'll be the people at the, if you like, front of the room when we come and make the final presentation. And the last thing is, there's a kind of new kit bag of tools, because I think one of the things you need to do, particularly if you start being proactive with the business, is you're going to find yourself in a position of, you're absolutely not going to be taking projects and taking orders. You're going to be reshaping projects, and you're going to be going out after certain things that you think You've got to be having a view on the strategy of the business and saying, you know what, there's an opportunity here where we could help with data analytics that we're not going after. There's a skills portion of that, which I just talked about. I think there's also an engagement with the business that is very different. How do you engage differently with the business? We put in place a bunch of things that I think were really interesting to help do that, be it consulting facilitation. We were creating things like an innovation hub. I think knowledge management is a really important aspect of this. There are a bunch of methods around innovation, which is kind of a better method of brainstorming. I think a lot of people are talking about Amazon's working backwards process. We experimented with that, found it really good, really helpful. And there's a sort of kind of a hackathon mindset, and you can actually literally do hackathons, and the bank was getting pretty hot on doing hackathons, and using that as ways to bring people together to come up with opportunities where data and analytics can be applied. And in fact, we I would say by the kind of end of the process, we had a kind of yearly learning event where we would which we would use as part of our get people up to a certain foundational level, and it changed each year. We kind of refined it each year, and the last one we did almost had a component where people actually came out of the event with, here are a bunch of ideas that we can now take to the business. So we came together, spent a couple of days learning some stuff, thinking about what we were doing, a bit of skills development, but then the outcome of the kind of working sessions of that team was to come up with a bunch of ideas that we could then almost use. They're almost like our pitch book for the following year. So that kind of makes the point that I think our story was one where we were probably doing a bit more selling of buckets than we'd like to. We wanted to do a bit more mining, and that was how we kind of shifted our way of doing that. I guess now is the $64 million question, which is, how do you find more gold? Now, if I really knew the answer to that, I probably wouldn't be on here doing webinars. I would be doing whatever it is and finding that gold myself. But I got some thoughts and got some ideas. I don't think there's any one thing you can do to get better at prospecting, get better at finding where the gold is. But I think there's a systematic approach you can take. So I was going to share some ideas of how you might want to do that. So 3 lenses. We're going to talk through very briefly, and then with a few examples, and then we're done. Roughly speaking, I love a good framework because I'm an ex-consultant. So drivers, decisions, and data. Those are the three Ds. 3 different ways of looking at this problem, and all 3 are potentially useful. And I'd love to have your thoughts on what you think of these, and more importantly, whether you've got others of your own, because I think this is an important area. So the first D is for drivers, and I think this is a pretty, hopefully this is one that people who are in these kind of teams are plowing through. But it's really important that you have a set of value models aligned with the financial KPIs of the business, and you're using those to think about, if you like, how value distributes and moves, or how the impact of your business distributes and how it moves. So what's the distribution of the stock of value? What's the distribution of the flow of value? New business, business flowing out, customers flowing in, customers flowing out. When you look at that stock and that flow, and you de-average across different attributes, different product sets, or different behaviors, or different channels, what kind of insight does that give you? And can you predict those changes? And can you find, for example, white spaces? Can you predict where white spaces might be? Because that is obviously areas where you might want to go after. So this is just basically about modeling business through multiple lenses, be it kind of at the customer level, so building customer level lifetime models, modeling customer journeys, building employee level models, or simply modeling the drivers of P&L. So I think this is a classic lens, and I say it's a fairly, I think, well understood one, but a really important one to start with if you don't have it, to make sure you have kind of fully plumbed this. So a possible example, classic example, use a lot in banking and in financial services, certainly. I think it's a very common strategy, and we've been doing some quite interesting things in this area, which would be creating customer persona clones, if you like. So clustering some of the data around how customers are behaving, finding people of high potential, not necessarily high value, it depends on what you're looking for. It could be people who are just about to flip to digital adoption, for example, or it could be people who are financially vulnerable that you want to go and do some kind of mitigation for. But finding people whose behavior represents an area of high potential objective, and then using your good sophisticated machine learning techniques, or even more just classic modeling techniques, to find lookalike customers. I think that's one method of going, one lens, that driver lens, one way of going after gold in the business. Decisions. This is a beautifully scary slide with a beautifully scary graph on the right. I think this can be a really interesting way of looking at the business. And it's one we use to good effect, which is essentially do almost, if you like, an audit of what are all the decisions and choices we're making as a business. And those could be big decisions like, should I buy this business? If you want to go to the real extreme, should I launch this product? Should I open this branch? All the way down to really small operational decisions that I make time and time again. Should I route this call here, or should I route this call there? But building that inventory of these are the decisions that the business are making, and then thinking about, okay, where do they lie on this kind of this spectrum of complexity and frequency? You can start to create buckets of, these are the complex, low frequency decisions that have a high payoff. So we should be thinking about, where are the opportunities to use analytics to simply bring new insight and data? Yeah, you can bring a new bucket to this one, because it's actually can be very, very helpful in making a big decision that many stakeholders are involved with. Could you model and simulate scenarios? I think the AI space has a really interesting role to play here. So I mean, I think there's we could do some really interesting things with using AI agents to kind of model customers, if you like, and use those as a kind of a, if you like, a synthetic research tool to help with kind of supporting strategy decisions. Kind of in the middle is perhaps the classic playground for certainly decision teams in the financial services space. So where are the pretty frequent decisions, but actually of a that I can scope down, they're relatively deterministic in terms of how I think about them. They've got a medium to high payoff. So classic would be, do I offer a customer a loan? What price do I use for this product? Do I onboard this customer, or do I accept this customer's credit limit, or whatever it might be? And clearly we can use a lot of, so understanding what are all those decisions and then saying which ones are we already applying analytics to was a very helpful way of finding new white space for us to go after. And obviously analytics can help speed up those decisions. You might be able to automate them, or if you can't automate them, then you kind of create a machine-human hybrid, and you can do the machine can create a recommendation, and the human can be the final arbiter. You can use it to establish boundaries or limits or cutoffs, and you can use it to optimize. And the lower end is high-frequency decisions that might have a low to medium payoff, and there is definitely I'm quite sure we're going to make a lot of progress in the next few years around speeding those up and automating those as we bring kind of components of AI and even just more traditional analytics to help automate and optimize those. So a quick example, right-hand side, the scary chart, which is sufficiently disguised that it gives anything away. Just kind of illustrates some things that we were doing and thinking. So lending pricing clearly is a very important decision to optimize within financial services. You can do a lot to shorten cycle times using things like Bayesian techniques, and you can do a lot to kind of model areas of, if you like, lack of knowledge in the market by using some of the more interesting, sophisticated modeling techniques that are now available. So actually, a great example where sometimes actually the technique itself can add value, and it's not just about having the good data. But ultimately, it is about having data. And the last one is data, and we're close to finishing. So the third lens that we found quite helpful was more data, believe it or not. I know a lot of people say, my God, we've got enough data. Why would we possibly need more? But I think those of us who have been modeling for a few years knows that actually the best way of getting an uplift on a model, the best way of getting more better performance out of some kind of decision-making device is put a new source of data into it. So I think this is a useful way of looking at the kind of data landscape, which is you can make better use of old data. So old data, new data, and borrowed data, if you like. I couldn't think of a category for blue data. If you've got an idea, think about it. Anyway, something old, something new, something borrowed. Something old is unused or underexploited data. And obviously, classically, when people talk about big data, this is an area where there might be all sorts of things we'd never thought of using before because it's unstructured or it's unmanageable or it's dirty or it's just so much of it. Previously, it was unimaginable that we could have used that for any kind of useful purpose. Of course, one of the great things about some of the new tools and the platforms that are available is now we can actually do what was previously unimaginable. So it's well worth, I think, looking at that old data and saying, is the stuff that we've just not used because previously it was not useful. But actually now the source of that data in itself sparks some ideas. Second one is harder to do, but can be incredibly valuable. So could I capture whole new sources of data by changing some kind of process in the business? Obviously, this is not something that's within the remit necessarily of the data team itself or the analytics team itself, but absolutely something that you can kind of co-create as a strategy with the business. Can I change the frontline system so I collect more a different sort of data? Can I create a new value exchange with my customers? So if I give them value through the data I'm collecting, is that a signal that they'll give me some more data, which I can then use to better serve them or create new products with? So that was the new data. And the last one was, how can I combine data from sources outside? And that might be, a better strategic relationship with my partners. So I create strategic partners with suppliers, and we start some kind of data sharing. Of course, lots of things to think about in terms of GDPR and the regulations around that, but also lots of potential value out there, and actually lots of really interesting technology emerging around how to do that safely and how to do that productively without risking individuals' privacy on either side of the fence. Can you purchase third-party data sets, or can you use some of the incredibly valuable open sources that are out there to merge with your own data? So those were, again, that kind of data lens was three ways of thinking about the data spectrum. I'm going to end on a couple of examples, but if we were together, we'd be having pizza and beer now. So what could we do in place? Go and grab yourself a beer. But in the absence of that traditional ability to drink something together, I thought I'd pick three examples and explain them through the medium of the alcoholic beverage. So these are three examples of data opportunities using alcohol. Starting with wine. So this is one of my favorite stories. Told this many times, many presentations, but it's really good fun. This guy, Uli Aschenfelter, his name doesn't get any easier to pronounce, an American economist, but he was famous for using data that had never been used before, which is in the Bordeaux region. They have years and years of data around what the temperature was like, what the rainfall was like, what the when the grapes were harvested, and he said, well, that's a lot of data. I wonder if it kind of correlates with the price of Bordeaux. So he got the data together, and lo and behold, he came up with a relatively simple regression model. It wasn't actually that complex. In fact, it was so simplistic that it earned him a lot of criticism from the wine drinking cognoscenti, who said, my beautiful Pauillac can't possibly be reduced to an equation. You must be mad. They even said he was. I think he presented his ideas at a Christie's meeting, and he was openly hissed. So this is not a popular guy in terms of the world of data analytics. But he had the last laugh because the problem is, and of course, the experts were saying a version of which we may have heard day to day in our own business world, that you can't substitute for human judgment with your data and your modeling. There's no substitute for human judgment. Too many imponderables, too many things that I, as the human expert, can do. And in some cases that is true, but as we all know, in more and more cases that's becoming not true. And he was right. This was one of those areas. So and the problem is, whilst you certainly can obviously tell a lot by the wine if you're an expert and you use what they call the swill and spit. The problem was when you first harvest a wine, you lay it down and it doesn't taste that good. So you can't really tell the value. You can't tell how valuable and how good the wine is going to be from the kind of the first version that sits in the barrel before it's matured. And yet it gets sold at that point. So people pay money to lay it down, or to buy barrels, or to invest in wine futures. So all you saw the opportunity. So, well, if I can value it better, there's a commodity I can value, and I could potentially do well. And he correctly predicted that 1989 would be the wine of the century, and he was right. And then he caused a lot of controversy because he actually said, and the following year, which is 1990, is going to be even better. And that, seems unlikely, right? Unlikely to have two consecutive wines of the century, but he was also right. So, and he now they now actually have a kind of wine growers what's the word, periodical that comes out that applies economic analysis to wine manufacturers. So I don't think he's completely replaced human judgment of wine. Never will, because there's too much fun in the tasting and the swilling and the spitting. But he certainly brought science to that industry. So that's wine. Who fancies a beer? So again, this is one of my favorite stories. I love this story. It has a sad ending, unfortunately, this story. But how can we use new data to manage beer? What's the new data for beer? Well, this is a great Internet of Things story. So every year, this is a US story, unfortunately, every year, there are 160 million instances of keg stockout. I think that means 160 million customers went up to the bar, said, have you got Scrotix Old Dirigible? And the guy said, no, I'm sold out. And of course, if I'm a dedicated drinker of that beer, then I might not have a beer at all, or I certainly, that's a loss to the brewer. So the estimate is about much as 33% drop in revenues from beer, from this stockout problem. And this device that was created by a company called Chauvelot, who made iKeg, the thing is called the iKeg system, was essentially a ring that you can see there that sits under the keg and weighs the keg, and an RFID tag that sits on the barrel that scores, that tracks the contents of the keg. And this thing's wired into the internet, and it's constantly feeding the contents of the keg back to the distribution system. And the reason I said this thing failed, unfortunately, the reason it shouldn't have failed, it should have been really good, is the dynamics of the US make this particularly valuable, because they have in the US this thing called the 3-tier distribution, which means legally you cannot be any one of you can only be a brewer or a distributor or a retailer. You can't be in any 2 or 3 of those businesses. So you've got to be separate. So there are 3 clients for this, right? There are 3 clients who get value from this data. The retailer wants to know when his barrels need replacing. The distributor wants to benefit from the models that might predict how can I optimize delivery, and the brewer can optimize their creation and their delivery of the beer. So lots of people benefiting, lots of people having this problem solved for them. So if anything, it's interesting that that it failed, and one wonders why it failed. But I think it went into liquidation, excuse the pun, at the end of 2019, sadly. But a great idea. I'm sure it'll come again. Look out for it. You heard it here first. And then the last of all, new data, borrowed data. I thought something to annoy the Scots would be good. AI-driven gin and AI-driven whiskey. So I did put making better whiskey and gin ? On the slide, just to be clear that I'm not necessarily advocating. These are the best examples of the sector. But this brand, Moncker's Garkle, was built by two guys. The two agencies who got together and produced an AI machine called Jeanette, which was based off the OpenAI neural network, the GPT-2 network. For those of you who follow these things, I think it was under a bit of controversy last year, but they used GPT-2 to actually not only create the recipe. So they filled it with recipes, with brand names, with characteristics of botanicals. It not only figured out the recipe that was going to be acceptable and a winner, it came up with a brand name and the label. Although actually, when I read that and I heard that, I actually thought, okay, I'm maybe not so impressed by the name Moncker's Garkle now. So yeah, it may make you think differently about it. But anyway, the brand, the label, design, and the copy on the label, i.e., describing what a wonderful mix of botanicals it is, was all created by the AI, and it was distilled by Circumstance Distillery. If you want to look it up and maybe even try some. And then on the whiskey, this thing called Intelligens, it was built by a Swedish distiller, Mac Myra, the first, possibly only, whiskey distiller in Sweden. I don't know, but certainly they were the first. Teamed up with a firm called Fourkind and built on an Azure platform. They built this AI model, again merging recipes, sales data, customer preferences, so to create this recipe that they think should be a hot seller because it's been picked by the AI as a perfect recipe. So, bit of wine, bit of beer, and end on a wee dram of whiskey. That's it. With a couple of final messages from our sponsors. So the first thing, again, we talked all about data. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of show this slide, which is given all the thinking that, given all the events that have recently happened in data, having some kind of data principles, I think, is really important. So that kind of goes hand in hand to these kind of data strategies. And certainly, this list of 8, I think we may have changed it slightly now, but this was 8 principles that the bank used to think about how it was going to use data in a way that was ethically fair. Clearly embedded within here, these are some legal things that GDPR require you to do, but this went beyond things like GDPR and beyond the privacy rules. But I think a really important way of important framing for gold mining opportunities with data is to have this as one of the important parts that feed into that. And then the last thing, a final, why should you care? I think for 2 or 3 reasons. So one, I think it matters at the business level. And I've said why, if we're making better shovels, it might give you an illusion of progress and distract from the real goal of what we should be doing, which is creating value through analytics. So I think it really matters at a business level. I think it matters if you care about this as a profession, as a function, i.e., that's what I do. I'm a data professional, therefore I kind of care what happens to analytics or data science as a function. Then I think it's really important that the teams that are in that function are connecting with the commercial value of what they create. Otherwise, you risk the analytics function sinking into irrelevancy or low influence, or in some cases back into irrelevancy or low influence. I think the function and the profession is just getting to the point where it's starting to get this either reports into the board level or maybe even has a board level position, because people realize running analytics on the business is such an important driver of strategy. And I think the only reason it's got to that point is because we're doing more analytics that is really about digging for the gold in the business. And then lastly, I think it matters at a professional level. I think people who can use analytics and figure out the use case and figure out where the gold is are going to be more important than the bucket sellers. There's a great website called Will Robots Take My Job? So go and Google it and look up your job in there. If you call yourself a statistician, you're okay. If you're a data entry clerk or a cab driver, not so much. But anyway, it's fun for play to see whether they think robots will take your job. And that's it. There's a summary slide for those of you who want to who weren't listening, but want to take away all the key messages. But hopefully that all made sense. We could leave this up and debate it if we want to have a bit of debate and discussion. But that's my closing slide. Thank you. Stay well as we all emerge from lockdown. Hope everybody's feeling well mentally and physically. But do please let me know what you think of these ideas, either email or LinkedIn, and let's have a chat.
Okay, fantastic.
Over to you, Robin.
Yeah, Nick, thank you so much, mate. That was absolutely brilliant. By my estimations, we've got about half an hour to go.
Yes, I went way over, didn't I? Never mind.
No, perfect, because it means we've got 7 questions currently sitting in Q&A. We've got roughly half an hour to go. We've still got just over 60 people in the room. How about you tackle each question in the Q&A firstly, run them down. So 7 questions, have a little stab at each one of them. Can you see them all okay?
I'll do my best. Oh no, have I got to, hang on. Oh, sorry, I should stop sharing my screen, I guess.
Yep.
And then I'm going to go for Q&A. This is testing my ability. Right. Cool. Okay, Paul. I've got to read and talk, read and think at the same time. So Paul said, is essentially making better shovels or mining gold? Is it about the ROI or the certainty that the request will be acted upon? So I think this is, I think this is less about ROI. So I think ROI is an important measurement that you can apply to kind of both sides of the equation. I think this is more about the practical business of, did the results of the work turn up in the P&L, or whatever your measure of success and is at the end of the year. Obviously, if you're running a charity or in government, your definition says might be different, but there'll be something that says that the ultimate owner of the organization or the institution will say, you know, I have succeeded when I made my PBT numbers or I made my return on capital numbers. That's the thing you want to influence. So it's more about that. ROI is a very useful method of selecting amongst different value creating projects. So I'm not denying ROI is a good measure. But I think my point, I think the shovels gold analogy is, you know, I can have the very, very, very best shovel. It's absolutely awesome. Anybody who uses this will definitely, or gold finder will find some gold. There's still a difference between selling that and then going out and digging in the sand yourself and coming up with a nugget. I have a question. What programs do you use to produce these graphs? Oh, guys, they are horrible PowerPoint charts, I suspect, and then they've been disguised so many times that they're almost just they're not really good charts. But some of the, so you may be referring to a couple of the test and control charts. We did have a software platform that it was a cloud as a service platform that was used to run our test and control. I'm happy to email me if you want a bit more details. That was one of the things we used to extract some of those pictures, but most of them are just ordinary PowerPoint. Paul, again, to enable some of the insight generation, operational deployment, you know, do you recommend that market research are joined to analytics and data science? Oh God, Paul, how long have you got? Yes. So Paul uses the phrase market research there. I talked about insights. I think one of the unique aspects of that team in Barclays